Hello and welcome to the Consistency of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. So in today's video, I'd like to talk about something I come up with, what I would like to call the 5 church offices. And people will be going, well, what are the 5 church offices? You talking about the 5-fold office of the ministry? No, what I'm talking about is like the 5 official offices established in the church throughout church history. Generally, there are just kind of 2 types of offices. There are clerical offices, so your office of the ministry, and your lay offices, so those who serve in the church, not with word and sacrament, but generally taking on the physical side of the church. And so I would recommend, if you haven't seen yet, my videos on the office of deacon and the office of deaconess, because I discuss a lot of this in those videos. But essentially, my list can be broken down into 5 offices, because you can take the office of the ministry and you can divide it in 3: bishop, priest, and deacon. Now, that is something established in the early church. Now, as Lutherans, in the Book of Concord, we teach that bishops, presbyters, and pastors are all the same office. And this is basically based on Acts 20:28 and 1 Peter 5:2, in which the term bishop, overseer, the term presbyter, elder, and the term pastor, shepherd, are all used in the same verse to refer to the same people. So they're the same thing. So in the Bible, the distinction between bishop and pastor is not something that exists. It's something that is later developed. However, as St. Clement will talk about in his first epistle, this does seem to be something that was established by the apostles, this division of the offices into bishop, priest, and deacon. So here a bishop will serve as the overseer, the priest will serve as the regular pastor, and the deacon will serve as the assisting pastor. And if you look in the Book of Concord and the Treatise of Power and Primacy of the Pope, Melanchthon quotes Saint Jerome, who himself attributes this practice to Saint Mark, who in Alexandria established the tradition of the pastors getting together and appointing a bishop to oversee them. And his job was generally to be, as Jerome said, a remedy to schism, that when there were theological debates and that you would have one person who was more learned and wiser than the lot others who could oversee us to make sure that you're not preaching heresy and to keep the rest of the pastors in line. This office is generally an office that kind of naturally occurs in the Bible. First, you have the apostles essentially serving as bishops. As the apostles go around and appoint pastors in other churches, they just naturally take on this leadership position. You have the Pauline congregations, you have the Petrine congregations, you have the Johannine congregations. You have Paul writing letters to the churches, John writing letters to the churches, where they essentially serve as these kind of overseeing bishops and leaders to these pastors. Particularly, you also then have a distinction of maybe like an archbishop, a bishop, and a priest. And you see this in the pastoral epistles to Timothy and Titus, because you'll get Chemnitz in his Enchiridion, where he will talk about the fact that Paul appointed Timothy as bishop over the church of Ephesus to appoint more pastors. You see the same thing where Paul appoints Titus over the churches on the island of Crete to appoint pastors there. So you have Titus and Timothy taking on these new leadership positions. Timothy is simply replacing what Paul was to him. Paul was a leader to all these Pauline congregations, and now Timothy will serve as a leader to the Pauline members at Ephesus. Likewise, Titus will serve as a leader to the churches on Crete. And so generally the idea of a bishop, in whatever regard you have, whether you want to call him a bishop, a superintendent, a superintendent, an overseer, whatever term you want to use, a president even, they're all essentially the same office. It's just an office of a leading pastor. And the role of the bishop is essentially to oversee the other pastors and to make sure that they're not preaching heresy. You then also have your regular pastors, and then you have your assistant pastors. And again, this is just something that naturally occurs in the scriptures. As you have Paul traveling around, he picks up all these other pastors that come with him, like Timothy and Titus and Silvanus and others, and they essentially serve as assistants to Paul. St. Luke as well, I'd add in there. These guys that they're with Paul, they're not the leaders, they're pastors, they're ordained members of the clergy, but they assist. You also see in the scriptures two other offices that pop up, what I would call deacons and deaconesses. So as Martin Luther taught, when the apostles appointed the deacons in Acts 6, the 7 deacons, Luther taught that they were not members of the clergy. They were laity. They were instructed to administer the charity, the almsgiving of the church, so that the pastors, the apostles, could continue to work through word and sacrament. So the deacons were originally established not to serve in word and sacrament, but to serve in the physical needs of the church, such as property, charity, etc. And again, the scriptures then divide up. You've got your male deacons and your female deacons. A good example of this happening in scripture, Priscilla and Aquila. Now, so there are some people that will teach that Aquila, a man, became a pastor or maybe even a bishop. But in the scriptures, he's not called this. Aquila is a layman and his wife Priscilla is a lay woman. And the best case of this is in the book of Acts when they meet Apollos. Apollos is a pastor and he is preaching to the church at Ephesus. But Apollos only knows about the doctrines taught by John the Baptist. And he is ignorant about a lot of the later teachings of Christ and the apostles. And so Priscilla and Aquila, who have been educated by St. Paul, they pull Apollos aside and they educate him. Notice that neither Priscilla or Aquila take on a leadership position or get up and preach in the church. They were not preachers, they were not teachers, they were laity. They only preach and teach privately by educating Apollos in a private matter. And so these are the 5 offices that you have in the church. You have your bishops, your priests, your deacons, your lay deacons, and your deaconesses. And when it comes to deacons and deaconesses, the difference between them and regular lay people is that they are called into an official office. So you see Phoebe the deaconess mentioned in the book of Romans. And I would say that Priscilla and Aquila would also be a deacon and a deaconess. They are officially called to do the work they are doing. Like the deacons of the 7 deacons in Acts 6, they are officially called to do this. It's not just a normal layperson doing charity. This is a layperson who is called by the congregation to do the congregation's charity work. And so the difference between a regular layperson and a lay office, whether that be a lay deacon or a deaconess, is that a regular layperson just does something, you know, off their own bat. They just, out of the goodness of their own heart, without a call, without the need of the congregation, they just do something. So like I could just, well, I'm a pastor, but let's say a normal lay person in a congregation, they could just go out and give out money and do charity and stuff like that. They don't need to be called by the congregation to do that. But if the congregation establishes an official charity and then they appoint people to be in charge of that, that is an official office inside the church. And so that's the difference between like laity and lay ministry. Yeah, so that's the difference, the 5 offices in the church that we see in the scriptures. We've got your bishops or your overseeing pastors. You've got your pastors, priests, presbyters, bishops as well. They can be called bishops. They just don't really serve in that leadership position. Then you have your pastoral assistants or deacons or elders. And then you also have your lay elders, your lay deacons, your lay assistants, and they can be both men and women. So that's the 5 offices that we find throughout the scriptures. This is not really like an official teaching of the coelc, like this is our official stance on something. This is just something that I noticed through studying the church and church history in the Lutheran confessions, that there seems to be this breaking down of the church into 5 official offices. Like I said, there are essentially just 2 offices in the church, those who teach and those who don't teach, as you see in 1 Timothy 5:17, where Paul talks about honouring elders who preach and teach and elders who don't preach and teach. So you have your clerical office and you have your lay offices. And essentially throughout church history, the clerical office has been broken into 3, your bishops, your priests and your deacons, and your lay offices have been broken into 2, your male lay deacons and your female lay deaconesses. So I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. I hope you've enjoyed this kind of video. It's not really answering a question, it's not really given an official position to the coelc, it's just me talking about something interesting I noticed in the scriptures and in church history. So goodbye and God bless.